15-minute or less lecture series, Human Anatomy, Chapter 25, the Urinary System. The urinary system looks deceptively simple. You have two kidneys, a right kidney and a left kidney, each kidney attached to the urinary bladder by the ureter, a right ureter or a left ureter, and then urinary bladder opens to the outside through a tube called the urethra. Functions of the kidneys include regulation of blood volume and composition, regulation of blood pressure, as well as the pH of blood, which again relates to blood volume and composition, production of two hormones, calcitriol, which helps in calcium homeostasis, and erythropoietin, which stimulates red blood cell production, and of course the excretion of cellular wastes in the urine, these wastes of course having been removed from the bloodstream. Also, the urinary bladder functions in urine storage and the urethra in urine transport and discharge. So the kidneys are located between the levels of the last thoracic and third lumbar vertebra, so they're in this proximate area underneath the diaphragm. They are protected partially by the floating ribs, and it turns out the right kidney is slightly lower than the left kidney, and this is because the liver is a really large organ and the right kidney gets pushed down a little bit to make room for the liver. All right, here is a transverse section of the abdomen, and you can see here a cross-section of the kidneys. You can see the kidneys have a space where blood vessels and other structures go in and out of the kidney. This is the renal hilum. The kidneys are attached to the posterior wall by adipose capsule, surrounded by adipose tissue or fatty tissue, as well as connective tissue, the renal fascia. The kidneys are not wrapped around by the peritoneum. They are retrograde, retroperitoneal, and yeah. So here is a view of a kidney. As you can see, it has this outer light colored tissue. This is the renal cortex. The renal cortex pushes in deeper between these triangular structures. These regions where the renal cortex pushes in deeper are referred to as renal columns. The triangular structures are known as one renal pyramid. So one triangular structure is a renal pyramid, and the renal pyramids end in a structure called the renal papilla. So renal pyramid ending in the renal papilla. And when you have all of the renal pyramids together, all of them collectively are known as the renal medulla. So a renal lobe is a section of the kidney which includes the renal pyramid, the renal cortex above it, and half of the renal columns on either side. The papilla, the renal papilla, fit into a tube-like structure called the minor calyx. So each pyramid fits into a minor calyx. The minor calyxes then carry urine into a larger structure called the major calyx, and the major calyxes all carry the urine to a even larger structure called the renal pelvis. The renal pelvis then exits the kidney. When it leaves the kidney, passing through the renal hilum, it becomes the ureter, which carries the urine down to the urinary bladder. Nephrotosis, or floating kidney, is when one of the kidneys becomes displaced from the posterior abdominal wall. As you can see here in B, one of the kidneys has been displaced. This can lead to major problems because the ureter can become kinked and prevent the flow of urine to the urinary bladder. Blood flow into and out of the kidney is critical since the kidneys are helping to control the composition of blood. So blood arrives via the renal artery. The renal artery then splits into the segmental arteries. The segmental arteries then split into the interlobar arteries found between the pyramids. Interlobar arteries then arc over the top of the pyramids. At this point, they are called arcuate arteries. And then the arcuate arteries push up into the cortex, where they're called cortical radiate arteries. The veins are in the same place, except they're, of course, transporting blood out of the kidney. So you got the cortical radiate vein, the arcuate vein, the interlobar vein, leading to the renal vein, which carries the blood out of the kidney. On the microscopic level, the arteries and veins, of course, have to connect up. So the cortical radiate arteries will eventually branch to form what's called an afferent arteriole. The afferent arteriole will lead to a capillary bed known as the glomerulus, which is found in the nephron, the functional unit of the kidney. Then the blood will leave the capillary bed called the glomerulus and enter the efferent arteriole. It will then enter a second capillary bed, either the vasa recta capillary bed or the peritubular capillaries. And then from here, it'll eventually enter venules and return via the cortical radiate veins to the arcuate veins, etc. Now, this structure, we have two capillary beds connected by an arteriole, is only found in the kidneys. This is a very special arrangement. So the nephron, as you can see here, is a series of tubes and a capsule that surrounds the glomerulus. This is the functional unit of the kidney. There are millions of nephrons per kidney. The first major portion of the nephron is the renal corpuscle. The renal corpuscle consists of the glomerular capsule, which has a parietal layer lying on the capillary bed called the glomerulus, and a visceral layer lying on the glomerulus on the capillary beds, and then a parietal layer that faces outward, sort of a spherical sort of shaped structure. This is where fluids filter out of the blood, so fluids leave the bloodstream into the glomerular capsular space. And then the second main region is the renal tubules, which connect from the glomerular capsule all the way to the collecting duct. And in this process of the fluid moving through the renal tubules, materials will pass back into the bloodstream and back out of the bloodstream. So the renal tubule has a few major regions. You have the proximal convoluted tubule that comes directly after the glomerular capsule. This is followed by the nephron loop, which dips down into the renal pyramid. It has a descending limb and an ascending limb. And then it leads to the distal convoluted tubule, which will then connect up to the collecting duct, which collects the urine. So, flow of fluid through the cortical nephron starts off again with the glomerular capsule. So fluids are filtered out of the bloodstream, out of the glomerulus into the capsular space, into the glomerular capsule. It will then enter the proximal convoluted tubule, go down the descending limb of the nephron loop, then up the ascending limb of the nephron loop, and then into the distal convoluted tubule, where the filtrate will then enter the collecting duct, and it is now officially urine. The urine then travels down the collecting duct toward the renal papilla, where it will enter the minor calyx, and then the major calyx, and so on. So there are two major types of neurons. There's the cortical neuron, where most of the nephron is in, there's the cortical nephron, where most of the nephron is in the cortex, with just a little bit dipping into the renal pyramid. And then there's the juxtamedullary nephron, where it has a very long nephron loop going deep into the renal medulla. And as a consequence, the urine produced by juxtamedullary nephrons are much more concentrated. And cortical nephrons are the majority, about 80 to 85% of all the nephrons. All right, so again, here is the glomerular capsule with the parietal layer facing outside, the visceral layer that lies against the glomerulus, against the capillaries. The visceral layer is made up of cells called podocytes, which completely surround the capillaries. Blood arrives to the glomerulus through the afferent arteriole and then exits through the efferent arteriole. The filtrate that then forms in the glomerular space will then leave out the proximal convoluted tubule. And up here, as you can see, is the ascending limb of the nephron loop, which is making a physical contact with the afferent arteriole. This contact between the ascending limb of the nephron loop and the afferent arteriole forms what's called the juxtaglomerular apparatus. In the ascending limb, you have the macula densa cells. These cells are very crowded together, and they're monitoring the composition of the urine in filtrate in the ascending limb of the nephron loop. And then you have the juxtaglomerular cells, which are some of the cells forming the walls of the afferent arteriole. These cells are smooth muscle cells that are helping to monitor blood pressure in the afferent arteriole. And the overall function of this structure is to help control the blood pressure in the glomerulus. So the glomerulus is a capillary bed. It is maintained at a pressure that is the highest for any capillary bed, but we don't want to get too high, because if the blood pressure gets too high in the glomerulus, then the capillaries will rupture and will prevent proper functioning of the nephron. All right, when we get inside the glomerular capsule with the podocytes of the visceral layer of the glomerular capsule lying on the capillaries, we see that we end up with a number of layers that form what's called the filtration membrane. First of all, we have the smooth muscle cells and the endothelial cells of the capillaries. They have many fenestrations or pores, allowing many fluids and large structures to start to filter out of the capillaries. Then you have the basement membrane of the capillary, which prevents large proteins, anything large protein size or bigger from passing through. Then you have the podocytes, which have these little processes called pedicels that intercalate with each other, and this helps prevent even more proteins from leaving. So that basically lots of materials that are really, really small can leave the capillaries, but proteins, anything protein size or bigger, cannot. So glomerular filtration occurs in the glomerular capsule. Lots and lots of fluid leaves the bloodstream. It has lots of waters and solutes, various things dissolved in the fluid, in the water. So things coming out are nutrients, waste, electrolytes, pretty much anything that is smaller than a protein. Then at the beginning of the renal tubules, we have a lot of tubular reabsorption. This is water and solutes returning to the bloodstream. So tubular reabsorption, reabsorbing things back into the bloodstream. They're going to be going into the peritubular capillaries and or the diaphragmatic capillaries. If this tubular reabsorption did not occur, then we'd have to urinate 100 times more often than we currently do. Finally, near the end of the renal tubule, there is some tubular secretion. This is materials going from the bloodstream back into the renal tubule. This helps to pull out any remaining waste in the bloodstream, drugs, excessive amounts of ions, basically fine-tuning the composition of blood to get the pH ideal and the blood at the ideal levels for various solutes. And this, of course, means that urine comes out of blood, which is pretty amazing if you think about it. Urine is coming from our bloodstream. All right, so we have within the proximal convoluted tubules simple cubital epithelial cells with microvilli. They are big on the tubular reabsorption, returning things to the bloodstream. Then we have the nephron loop with simple squamous cells and simple cuboidal cells, again returning things to the bloodstream, tubular reabsorption. And then in the distal convoluted tubule and part of the collecting duct, we have simple cuboidal epithelial cells, which are big on the tubular secretion, returning things back to the filtrate, back into the nephron, especially pH, so hydrogen ions, especially hydrogen ions are big for being returned to the filtrate so that our blood is at the correct pH. Renal failure is when you have a decrease or cessation of glomerular filtration. This can be acute and only occur for a little while because of various causes, or it could be chronic. If it's chronic, then it'll end up being progressive, and over time, a person's kidney function will decline further and further until they no longer have functional kidneys. Then they will need to use a machine to clean their blood for them, a dialysis machine, going to it 3 or 4 times a week, sitting there for many hours to get their blood cleaned up. And ideally, they'll also be put on the list for a kidney transplant because getting a new functional kidney will mean they don't have to go through dialysis anymore. Ureters are tubes, muscular tubes that connect to the urinary bladder. They have a mucosa layer, a muscularis layer, and an adventitia layer. They move things by peristalsis, and then they open up into the urinary bladder. And as pressure in the bladder gets higher and higher because of it filling with urine, this will close off these ureteral openings to prevent backflow. The urinary bladder is also a muscular bag with many layers of smooth muscle tissue. When it is stimulated, it will constrict in order to push the urine out through the urethra. There is a trigon, a smooth area. It's called a trigon because it connects the 2 urethral openings with the internal urethral opening to the urethra. Also, there are many ridges within the urinary bladder called the rugae. These are folds that, of course, can stretch out when the urinary bladder fills. There are 2 urethral sphincters, the internal urethral sphincter that we do not control, and the external urethral sphincter that we do control. And of course, urine has to pass through these sphincters to go out the urethra and out of the body. There's a slight difference between male and female urinary system. Basically, the female's urethra is significantly shorter than the male's urethra, probably because the male's urethra has to pass through the prostate and through the penis before reaching the outside. Also, the male's urethra is also part of the male reproductive system, while the female's urinary system is completely separate from their reproductive system.